Don't see his sushi yet. Oh, there he is. He just got here. Nice. It's like I imagined you and you showed up. And Yasushi, I didn't get to comment on your fantastic Knit backdrop yesterday. You're bringing me back to many hours inside of that. Okay, so I think everybody is here, if I'm not mistaken. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the studio, the thesis sequence, introduce our students, and introduce our wonderful collection of critics today. First, I need to pull up one thing, I'm sorry. All right. This is Tulane School of Architecture graduate thesis. And I think in the email that I sent out to all of the critics, I mentioned that the thesis sequence at Tulane is optional. We do that for a number of reasons, but one of the primary reasons is that because some of our design build offerings are multi-semester, it would prohibit our students from being able to take advantage of some of those opportunities if we made thesis mandatory. So this cycle, we had 8 brave students take on a new thesis path this year. Previously, graduate students were coupled with the undergraduate students in the thesis sequence, and they would take a thesis prep class and then the design studio sequence with the undergrads, and they might be intermixed with faculty overseeing about 12 students. In this version, what we've done, and this is the first cycle of it, so I'm really excited to get feedback from the critics at the end about some of their observations in general. But the way that it's worked was students elected to work with a faculty member. They chose a faculty member that shared similar research interests as their hypothetical project at that point. And so we paired students with individual faculty, and they worked really in an independent study capacity with that faculty member throughout the year. So in the fall semester, they did a 3 credit hour independent thesis research course where they developed a research proposal, and all of the students presented those collectively at the end of the semester. So for example, my 2 students and I would meet with each one of them for 1 hour per week to talk about their thesis research. And then in the spring semester, we did a more traditional, design studio format where the students were working in a design capacity and context. And but again, we continued the independent study format. So although there was a cohort of 8 students, the faculty would meet with the students at their agreed upon schedule. So again, in my case, for example, I would meet with my 2 students on Tuesdays and Thursdays, each for an hour at a time. So 4 contact hours with my 2 students per week during this semester. And sometimes we would do joint meetings, depending on what the activities of the day were. But each faculty member and the student that they were working with had at their discretion, they could set up that schedule. So although there's a cohort, the theses are very independently driven and directed by the faculty member that's overseeing them. So in this cycle, in today's session, we will be seeing 4 students. 2 of the students have worked with Ann Yoakum, and 2 of the students have worked with me. So Brandon Sertain will be first, followed by Casey last, followed by Seneca Gray, and then followed by Lucy Satsowich. So Brandon worked with Ann Yoakum, Casey worked with me, Seneca worked with Ann, and Lucy worked with me. So you'll get to meet all of them shortly. But I do want to introduce our critics briefly, unless if there are any questions that I can address at the moment about the way that the studio and the research was undertaken. Okay, it doesn't look like there's any questions. Okay, so first we have Laura Blocker, who is the director of the Masters of Preservation Studies program at Tulane University. Thank you, Laura, for coming today. I don't get to see you enough on reviews, so it's a real pleasure to have you join us today. We have Yasushi Ishida from Cal Poly Pomona. I've known Yasushi for years now. We started working together at Morphosis Architects a long time ago. But Yasushi has the kind of the distinct honor of having worked at just about every major office in Los Angeles. Most recently in a professional environment, he was instrumental in developing the facade system for the Broad Museum. We have Margarita, actually, is Margarita here? No, she's not. I'll try to send her a text or send her out an email. But Margarita Joubert is a professor at Tulane University, part of the practice Alde Joubert out of Barcelona. We have Elizabeth Kislacey. Thank you, Liz, for joining us for another day. Welcome back. Liz is a colleague of mine from University of Michigan when we worked on our PhDs together. She is currently a professor at Miami University in Ohio as an assistant professor, recent accolade. The students heard this yesterday, but for the new critics joining us, Liz was the recent recipient of the JAE Article of the Year Award, which is a tremendous honor amongst many other skills and abilities. So thank you for coming back, Liz. We have Judy Kennard, a professor at Tulane University. Thank you, Judy, for joining us today. You've been a consistent voice throughout this process when we've had reviews, so really appreciate you taking the time to join us on this last day. We have Javier Gonzalez Mosquera. Javier, there you are on my screen. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Madrid. I know it's probably getting kind of late there. Hopefully your baby's already asleep. But I got to know Javier last year when he was a fellow at Tulane, and we hit it off. And in an amazing fashion, I somehow got lucky enough to join his dissertation committee and had the real honor of participating in a committee review in Madrid just before the pandemic hit. I think if it had been a week later, I don't think I would have been able to see it. But you know, it was an amazing experience, and you did an amazing job. And thank you so much for to join us today. The students loved you when they got to work with you last year, so really appreciate you making the time. John McMurrough. John, man, you were my PhD advisor, and it is an absolute honor for you to join us today. It's, you know, I can't speak highly enough about John. I mean, he's been probably the most instrumental person in my development as an academic, and I wouldn't be able to have done anything without him. And I appreciate him more than anything. John is a theorist and critic. He's also a trained architect, and his writing permeates all of the important journals that we have out right now, as well as a number of chapters in books. So John, thank you so much for making the time to join us today. It's a real treasure. I do hope we get the opportunity to bring you down to New Orleans in the near future. We have Graham Owen also joining us from Tulane University. Graham is an architect and a theorist. And we also have Carol Reese joining us from Tulane University. Carol is our resident historian and scholar. Thank you also for being a consistent voice on these reviews. You've been a part of it from the fall semester's presentations and a number of the conversations we've had this semester. So thank you so much for taking the time again to join us today. And I will introduce the thesis faculty. We have 5 faculty, one of whom I think actually got roped into another review today and isn't able to be here. So Scott Bernard, whose students went yesterday. We also have Emily Taylor Welty. Emily's student Kaylin went yesterday as well. We have Kentaro Tsubaki, Associate Dean at the university, and his student Xiao Lan also presented yesterday. And we have
and I'm stepping down. This is official now.
Yeah, so this is your last maybe official review. I'm not sure, but it might be your last official review as Associate Dean. So thanks for everything. Yeah. And we have Ann Yoakum, who is a professor of practice and director of the Small Center, who oversaw 2 of the thesis students today, so Brandon and Seneca. And then I think most of you know me, but I'm Ben Smith, and I'm an assistant professor and director of the graduate school at Tulane School of Architecture. So welcome, everybody. I don't want to take up more time with introductions. We can dive right into it. We'll have 4 presentations today. The students are prepared to do a 15-minute presentation, followed by a 30-minute discussion by the critics. I'm really looking forward to the conversations. I'll be quiet until needed. All right, Brandon, take us away, sir.
All right, we'll do. Let's see. Is my screen sharing okay?
Looks great, Brandon.
Yeah, you can see it. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. First and foremost, I hope all of y'all are well and good physical, mental, emotional health, etc. My name is Brandon Sertain. I've been advised by Ann Yoakum, and this is How to Rectify the Physical Disappearance of the Black Environment that Fostered New Orleans' Black Culture. Synopsis. The African and African-American cultural influence in New Orleans is intertwined with the origins of New Orleans itself. Even though Black residents were pushed to the margins and attempts were made to suppress them physically and systematically, they still persevered. While the cultural contributions from these people and the places they lived are still very prominent in New Orleans, the physical memories of their past is decay and being demolished before our eyes. In a city that celebrates, honors, and talks with its dead, where are the monuments to the Black people and places that have been integral in the culture and ethos of New Orleans? So, as an experiment, I tried to imagine what it would be like to not know anything about New Orleans, and to essentially, what it would be to discover New Orleans for the very first time, and inevitably what that might look like in 2020 would be a Google search. And so I just Googled a couple of things that I thought, might resonate with what make a place unique. And so I Googled New Orleans culture, New Orleans music, and New Orleans religion. And what I did in these frames that we're looking at is I essentially blotted out only the pieces that weren't directly referring to Black New Orleans' culture. And so we can see it's a pretty large amount. This is at the top of the page. I didn't scroll down or edit it in any other way otherwise. And essentially what I would have imagined if I knew nothing about New Orleans is that its Black residents are sufficiently recognized and not relegated to the odd statue or the corner of a park, which, by the way, was legally named after a Confederate leader for more than 100 years until 2011. That's Congo Square I'm referring to, was Beauregard Square legally, who was a Confederate leader for over 100 years. So what is culture? Oxford says, culture is the customs, art, social institutions, and achievements of a particular nation, people, or other social groups. Merriam-Webster is the customary beliefs, social forms, material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. The American Sociological Association says, sociology understands culture as the language, customs, beliefs, rules, arts, knowledge, and collective identities and memories developed by members of all social groups that make their social environments meaningful. So, just so that we can share a common language, I essentially settled on culture as people and place over time, so that we're all on the same page about how we define it. So a couple of precedents that I've looked at of people who've gone on to try to memorialize events, memorialize people, are Sarah Zodi, And she did a project where she essentially diagrammed out what was the Valongo Wharf from Rio de Janeiro, which was a big destination for the transatlantic slave trade. Sue Mobley and Brian Lee have a project in New Orleans called Paper Monuments, where they're essentially telling Black stories in the form of poster and written story. This is a similar, or this is another form of storytelling, memorializing, but on a different scale. And Maya Lin designed the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which again is another form of memorialization that takes place on a more localized scale. So who am I looking to memorialize? I'm looking to memorialize the anonymous residents of New Orleans, the subjugated, if you will. As James Baldwin said, the ones that, as we were taught, that that about whom the less said, the better, essentially. And why does it matter? The museum in DC, National Museum of African American History and Culture, is really a narrative museum, the nature of people and how you represent that story. It was a quote by David I.J. Architecture can serve as a powerful tool in preserving the community's memory of its past. This preservation of memory can manifest in forms and scales, from the individual designer to the collective. There is value in conceiving ways to memorialize people and places. This is especially pertinent in New Orleans, where the places that fostered immense cultural contribution from its Black residents has changed drastically or disappeared altogether. So those without names, sorry. So I'm looking to talk about those without names or, shiny histories. And this isn't a purely emotional appeal. There are social and economic benefits to intentionally memorializing people and culture as well. There's no coincidence that on business trips, people come to New Orleans a day early and leave a day late. So these are essentially the sites that I've recognized as having significant impact on New Orleans' culture, and also happen to be housed by New Orleans Black residents historically. The Magnolia Projects, the Callio Projects, O.C. Haley Boulevard, Claiborne Avenue, Congo Square / Treme, and Bayou Road. So this is essentially a synopsis of why those places are relevant. And I'll just go over them briefly. Congo Square is pretty much the birthplace of all this, in my opinion, because Congo Square was an area where enslaved people would be able to go on Sundays and essentially be able to be African again. So they would be able to partake in their song and their dance, their market, their traditions, customs, etc. And so for today, I'm going to spend the bulk of my time talking about Congo Square and sort of trying to figure out a framework to analyze it from. So there are a couple of different frameworks by which to analyze a place, a people, etc. There's sort of the mathematical approach, which usually looks like this thing plus that thing, etc., equals something, and is completely disengaged, in my opinion. And then there's the linear approach, which is sort of characterized as a top-down approach, engaged on the back end, which I think we're all familiar with, right? Think of a project as a way to help, and then sort of go in the last minute to vie for community participation, engagement, etc. And then there's what I call the immersive approach. This is a front-end approach. It's qualitative and based off of the experience of the people, of the place, sensory experience, etc. There's no rulers or notepads, essentially. So looking at Congo Square, I took some of the materiality, circulation, vegetation, activity, density, and sort of settled in on what the spirit of this is all about. And what's the symbol in the middle? I'm glad you asked. Um, the symbol is in the Dinkra symbol called the Sankofa. It's an African word from the Akan tribe in Ghana. The literal translation of the word and the symbol is, it is not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind. This is pertinent because this is essentially what I'm aiming to do with this project, acknowledging that there's a significant cultural contribution from a people and place, and those people and places are at risk of being left behind. And this is sort of a launching off point to rectify that. So this is an aerial photo of where Congo Square is, photo taken by Jose Cado, and we can see its relationship to the river, its relationship to the lake, its relationship to the Treme area, Claiborne, etc. So this is a current site plan of Congo Square and you know, Armstrong Park as a whole. And I have began to sort of think of a visioning proposal for essentially what will function as a social empowerment space, an educational space, a cultural empowerment space. And this is mostly a formal study, as there are a lot of things that I want to touch on. But formally, it essentially references the Sankofa symbol that I mentioned earlier. The symbol that essentially says it's okay to learn from the past. It's important to not let those, things die off with its people. This is an open floor plan. So sectionally, the space would function essentially like an open space. And we can see on both levels, one level looks out over the Treme neighborhood and one level looks out over the river. And the bottom floor, again, would essentially function as a flexible space that can be able to contribute to significant cultural events, learning, etc. And now I'm just going through some of the formal decisions made and how it begins to reference some of the things that I've been talking about. So as you can see, the form is sort of unorthodox. It references the Sankofa symbol that we talked about earlier, a symbol that is very important to New Orleans and one of the most used symbol in ironworks, etc. But so formally, it represents movement, which leads to my next point. This is a static proposal, but there's also a dynamic spatial staple within New Orleans called the second line. And the second line, known for its song and dance, this tradition goes back and is almost, for hundreds of years. This is evidenced by a drawing. This drawing on the left is from 1835, and the photograph on the right is from 2007. And so we can see that these cultural customs are very much embedded in the city and prominent to the city. So a writer, Frederica Vermeer from 1853, said of the second line, "They were obviously cases of possession. They leaped and twisted their bodies around in a corkscrew fashion. This dance would commence and continue indefinitely. Imagine the leaps and corkscrews mentioned by Frederica in 1853. And this leads me to my next slide. So this footage is footage I captured from the last legal second line that was held in New Orleans pre-quarantine. And so in 2020, the writer's description of these leaps and corkscrews, ironically, are still very much present in what's going on today, minus the demonization, essentially. And so on the diagram next to it, I begin to think about how to spatially analyze a thing. And I took 30 frames from the video that we just watched and started to sort of track, you know, the relationship of his shoulders to his hips and the relationship of his right foot to his left foot within the plane. And this is essentially an attempt to begin to diagrammatically define, you know, the second line with relation to the individual and the aggregate movement of the second line. So there are times when there's an active individual within a static aggregate. There's a static individual within the aggregate. And this speaks to sort of the procession of the second line when I say static and active. There are different planes of movement. There's a different rhythm of movement as well. Much of what this has taught me is that it's pretty hard to sort of define the movement, but you know it when you see it. So these are more diagrams sort of laying out what the procession is like and showing an example of how, you know, this is essentially, this thing is made up of a bunch of separate pieces, right? Like it's not one unified thing, it's a bunch of people that comes together. And even within the second line, there are points when the second line stops and the band switches out and the crew switches out. And so again, it's sort of this cultural thing where it's made up of many different pieces and not one thing more important than the next. So everyone is a part of this public stage, if you will. And in summation, while we're practicing social distancing, let's join in on a virtual second line, memorializing past places and visioning for the future. All right. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Well, thanks for the presentation. It's a lot to think about. It's such a rich territory of material, and I'm just trying to kind of process how to respond. Maybe I'll just start with a question, and I guess I'm not entirely sure, and maybe you can help me understand if what it is that you're attempting to rectify, as your title suggests, is something physical, something cultural. You use the word memorialize. Memorials are usually created for things that are already gone, you know, people that have died, cultures that have, you know, pretty much died. But what you're showing and what you're describing are really ongoing cultural practices.
Mhm.
And so can you tease out if it's like, I mean, because you did identify those 6 sites, and so those 6 sites are historically important, and I
Mhm.
assume continue to be. And so maybe can you say a little bit more about like what it is that you're aiming to preserve or memorialize, if you're in fact using that term?
Mhm. So a position that I, took pretty early on, um, is that much of what I'm pointing out, you know, comparatively, right, like within this presentation is very much present, but much of this is sort of on the fringes, on the margins. And so, like I was saying, if I were to do a Google search, for example, of sort of cultural artifacts or things that are related to the culture, sort of very prevalent online. However, within the city, I think there is not much that speaks to those things, um, in terms of built form, educational form, social form. So a thing like, for example, that I look at all the time, and I don't mean to offend anyone. The second lines that get shown on television, for example, they aren't the actual second lines that happen in the city. They're people like just kind of walking around with umbrellas through the French Quarter in suits, right? Um, and so that's sort of a commodification of what was an authentic, real thing, right? And so a part of what I want to do is bring that authenticity to the forefront, because I think a lot of sort of the cultural contribution that's being exported, um, begins to sort of get watered down, if you will. If that
Brandon,
makes
can I jump in? Because I'm curious to this, when you talk about trying to preserve authenticity,
yes.
I think that's a really interesting motivation. And I'm just curious, outside of the specifics of New Orleans, like, is there something that you could call an authentic monument? Like, how would we understand? Because already to monumentalize something is to take it out of a continuum and abstract it in some way or represent it. So I'm curious about this axis of like representation and authenticity and how you might think about those two things. I don't know, working together or working cross grade.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for that question. Actually, that isn't something that I explored explicitly. However, I would say that sort of me pointing these things out, right? Like me putting these things on a presentation and speaking about it for 15 minutes would make it seem like, the people that are represented in this have a much larger role within the society. And living here, that certainly isn't the case. And so in this, I can speak to, New Orleans more so than any other place. Um, I think an authentic monument to that would be something that brings these people, these stories, these origins to the forefront, more so than skipping around the French Quarter and calling it a second line.
I I don't know that much about New Orleans culture to judge if those sites or places are the right ones. I assume they are the ones, but I think you brought us some strategies to say how to convert those into a monumental thing. And I'm curious about that mathematical immersive attitude that nevertheless I miss throughout the rest of your presentation. You present those 5 or 6 points, but I cannot identify them clearly in the Congo Square project and the Second Avenue project. I think that's a strategy that could be applied anywhere because it's an attitude. So it's not just about New Orleans. So I think that's the main, for me, the main and best point you brought us here today that could be used anywhere. So if you could explain that a little bit more, I would appreciate that.
Yeah. So a part of this, a part of what's in my thesis work, there are a lot of, some things that I had to sort of get edited out, but the idea of being able to export this framework out. And so, yeah, all along I've been able, having conversations with Anne and others that have been helping me about sort of how this could be relevant to many other places. So, for example, this presentation, these sites, this mode of thinking may look completely different to a person of, to an indigenous person that grew up in New Orleans, right? But yeah, the framework is about not going into any particular situation with assumptions, not taking a top-down approach, not sort of having solutions in mind and then guiding people to go to that place. And it isn't necessarily an argument of expertise, but more so, more so an acknowledgement that we can't know a place without spending time sitting in that place in a way that isn't immediately looking to extract something.
If I could ask a follow-up question,
Mhm.
Are you trying to kind of reinsert kind of physical evidence or like a physical presence into an area where the Black community has been kind of displaced because of, say, like gentrification? Or are you inviting, people into where kind of Black culture is practiced now?
So the former. I would like to be able to, introduce people to areas who may have not otherwise been introduced to it. Full disclosure, this is a project that I will continue to work on. And so what that exact proposal is, I don't have that answer right now, but ideally it would reintroduce people to places that were otherwise forgotten about. For example, the housing projects here were, significant for a number of, cultural and pop cultural contributions. They're demolished. They're all but demolished. The one photo that I have is literally the one standing building of what was the housing projects in the Calio. And so, people who are familiar with the music that came out of there, the artists that came out of there, the places that came out of, the people that came out of there, there's not much in terms of, placemaking, in terms of signage, in terms of contribution. There's not much there to be able to say, hey, this is, very much intertwined with New Orleans. And so a part of my aim is to acknowledge that and then be able to, start a conversation about, okay, how do we reintroduce those things? How do we inform people again? Like, how do we get people to become interested in those stories?
I mean, I think in that case, I mean, with your present, I don't know if you've done this in your project or if you've just didn't have time to include it in the presentation, but I think the project could benefit from a survey of the way that other people have done this, because I think, I mean, what you're getting to is, I mean, the problem of the ephemerality of bodies and memory is a huge issue in heritage discourse, and particularly like difficult heritage. And so one project that comes to mind is the Stolpersteine. This was I'm forgetting the artist's name, but it translates to stumbling blocks. And so it's an artist that has gone around mostly Europe and basically created these little golden cobblestones and engraved them with the name of Jews and others who were murdered by the Nazis, and then placed them in, like, you can imagine European cities, these cobblestone streets, these little golden cobblestones, like the last place someone lived, or if that's demolished, the last place they like went to school or worked. And so if you go to Berlin or like any of these cities, there's a kind of reintroduction of a physical presence of a place where someone once lived, or worked. And of course, I mean, as we all know, bodies are ephemeral, but this is a way of reintroducing a kind of permanence. And so I'm just wondering if, you know, you've looked at some of these strategies like the one I just described, to see what kind of strategy might work in the context that you're addressing.
I'm sorry, what was the artist's name you mentioned?
I have to look it up, but the
So,
project,
if I can jump in, I just quickly did a search on the article, which I believe this is the one you're talking about.
yeah, thank you. Yes. Yeah.
And if I can continue, if I can jump in and just continue speaking, because my baby's away right now. So I'll start with tangential information and then end with a critique. So I think I was particularly intrigued by one statement in your presentation, which I'm looking for right now. It was, yeah, so where it says why it matters, architecture can serve as a powerful tool in preserving a community's memories of its past. And that's a really powerful statement, and it's very intriguing. And that actually kind of reminded me of this film and the book. I've only seen the film, but it's a documentary film called Destruction of Memory, directed by Tim Slade. It basically sort of like follows several, apparently globally. I mean, you might remember some of the, I'm blanking out on specific names, but you know, those huge Buddha statue in like Afghanistan got bombed. You know, there are all these kind of sort of, you know, intentional targeted destruction of these cultural monuments by current regimes that's opposed to these, you know, who's very much interested in, you know, there's been like horrible examples of like ethnic cleansing and stuff like that. You know, that's basically, I mean, everywhere, right? Like that's murders, you know, whether it's, you know, former Yugoslavia in 90s or wherever, you know, genocide happens in many places, which is killing of the people. But as much, the film argues that distracting these cultural monument is as damaging as literal killing of people, right? And not only they, you know, precisely because of the statement that you, I don't know if that's your statement or the quote, but precisely because architecture serves as a preserving, you know, tool in preserving communities' memories of its past. If those sort of symbolizing monument gets lost, part of their collective memory is lost. So that's very important. So that's why I wanted to introduce. You know, I think you will find this very interesting. So I would love you to see that. And I'm glad that you mentioned that this is the project that you continue to work on. I feel like, you know, again, this is not a criticism. It's sort of like relates to what I was talking about yesterday. My own graduate thesis was very much like that, so I can very much relate to it. You try to tackle on a very, very large and heavy subject, and which you, if you so choose, you could spend your entire professional career on, right? So because it's such a giant task, sometimes it's very hard to take the first step because what you're targeting is this, and you can only do this much, right? And therefore you try to sort of tackle the whole thing, and like we see these series of dots that tries to implicate this large sphere, but because there are so few of those dots, we can't really see them. If you did that a million times, we start to see the foggy shape of the sphere, right? So we have to be very much aware of that. Like what we can do at any given foreseeable time frame is a size of the dot. So, and you know, potentially and very likely you would never get to cover the whole sphere, even in your entire life. So that's why I think the scholars end up specializing in very specific areas, right? Like you become an expert in like I can't really hand gesture, but like that, you specialize in this tiny piece of pie, and at least you cover that entire piece so that you can contribute to the whole of, you know, collective society. so in that sense, I feel like, you know, the gesture that you took was very daring, but I wish that you would spend more energy on specificity of your architectural project, right? You know, you quote David Ajay talking about how, you know, the museum is a narrative of museum. So you know, I think if I were to spend some extra time on this specific project, I would try to sort of, I mean, that dance move and the choice of the site and the symbolic thing, you know, which could be you know, controversial, but you know, you took a stance, so that's okay. Like, at least, like, we want to see what that narrative is, what your story is. I want you to tell a very, very specific story, which is probably only a chapter in this series of books that tells the history of African American in New Orleans, right? So yeah, so that's, you know, the architecture should, you know, this presentation, if you could have spent more time, a bulk of time talking about your architectural proposal, I think at least, you know, you're, by that point, you're narrowing down very much of what you do, but at least you painted that narrow band with solid color so that we can see that band, right? And then I would stop talking, sorry.
Thank you for that.
Brandon, if I could offer some observations, it's Graham Owen.
Hey, Graham.
I'm following on some of Elizabeth's and Yatsushi's observations and wondering about the question of authenticity, which is a large and slippery beast. Is there possibly a dimension in what you're seeking to memorialize, which is historically transgressive in nature, characterized by being unofficial, mobile, intentionally ephemeral, to some extent rising out of the historical subaltern role that the Black community has experienced? And if that's so, does monumentalization sometimes shade into institutionalization? You've proposed a singular and localized monument in what you've shown us in Congo Square. Liz has suggested the relevance of distributed interventions like the Stumblestones. And I wonder if that would carry through some of the ambitions that you've stated in a way that is less prone to the risks of singular monumentalization, which can displace and substitute for that which is memorialized.
I thank you for the comments and questions, first and foremost. I think the comment in particular about the, you know, potentiality of telling sort of a story as transgressive, I've always operated under the impression that if, like, history is shaped by who's telling the story, right? And so being able to categorize things as official, unofficial, et cetera, I think in large part is there's some subjectivity even within that. And so, for example, I grew up in New Orleans, and there are certain stories, customs, language, et cetera, that's very different than what is maybe documented or recorded. And so, yeah, this is definitely trying to tell a story from a very particular place. And while I think I'm answering your question, you know, while some of the customs, there's a There's a element of ephemeral nature within there. But I think it's very much relevant to a particular group of people. And I would say it aims to, to be able to bring those people to light, even if they weren't able to tell the story as it was happening. I think I answered your question.
Brendan, having followed your project a bit over the course of the semester, I'm admit to being slightly surprised to see a building at the end, because I was somehow expecting the design to focus on something that was more dispersed, and yet I'm going to play the advocate for the building. Having visited the museum in Washington by David Adjaye, whatever the merits of the structure as a piece of architecture are, it seems to be hugely important to the community who stand in line to see it. Buildings can create a place that allows people to gather and reflect. And so I just want to make a couple of comments about the building. I suspect it was somewhat late in the process, but I think the formal gestures are quite interesting. The siting is interesting. I personally find questions about two things. One is the sort of smooth, seamless materiality of the skin strikes me as something that one could question, because it feels like it's trying to promote the fluidity of the dance gesture, but I would expect that something that made recognition of multiplicity, movement, seams, the hand might be interesting. And then I was also kind of surprised about the columns, and I was wondering if you had given much thought to the role of the column in the structure.
So is that a okay look at a view? Yes, so in the sort of fluidity of the form, and again, just to clarify, this is mostly just a formal exercise, does speak to the tradition of song and dance. And so I was like sort of hinting at that, and the columns that are implemented were referencing what was in the video of the second line. So like where the Claiborne overpass is, and
the highway pylons. Yeah.
Yes, and how significant that is, even today, to the second lines and parades. I think there's sort of a poetic irony about the fact that the implementation of this was something that was horrific for the Black community. Destroyed hundreds of homes and businesses, and then fast forward 50 years, and it's essentially a staple in New Orleans community at large. And so I thought there was some poetic translation to be seen there.
Great, thanks, Ben.
I think we have time for maybe one more comment. It looks like, Carol, did you just post something in the chat? Or Laura, I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut anybody off.
We jump in. So I think this is really important work, and I hope that you really will be continuing it for the rest of your career. I think starting with your title, you get to some very specific aspects of this work. Rectify physical disappearance. So even starting with rectify, we can think of that in a couple of different ways. We can think of rectify as being a fixing. We can also think of rectifying as being an aligning of these two different physical existences, the today and the what is lost. And I think that thinking of those dualities are important to continue in your work. As a number of the other critics were indicating, I was sort of surprised by seeing you come to this one museum, but I think that's an
Mhm.
important part of it, because it seems like you're looking at two things: recognition of
Mhm.
history and memory of it, and perhaps two different audiences in
Mhm.
there: people coming to New Orleans, seeing it from the outside, people in New Orleans, coming up in New Orleans, needing to understand
Mhm.
their history. So I think it's important to keep those things in the front of your mind as you look at this as the big project.
Thank
I
you.
can see this singular museum being one important part of that, along with many other different means of interpretation that both try to keep those lost places alive
Mhm.
in memory, and also give recognition to them such that we will not continue to destroy our historic fabric. And that gets to the second part of your title, the built environment that fostered New Orleans Black culture. And I think that's that word fostered is really important, because so often when we think of what we should preserve, we think of things that are specifically associated with something, you know, so we can identify these individual musicians' houses or places that are specifically associated with them. But what about that whole neighborhood? What about that whole place? I was recently interviewed about, you know, preserving jazz musicians' homes, and I was making the point that it's easy to look back from now and identify that singular person in their place as something to be preserved. But if we don't acknowledge the whole place that fosters that cultural creativity in the first place, then you're missing it. The one particular concern or question I had about the development of such a museum in Congo Square was, and this may have been part of your work that just wasn't part of the presentation, was how that could fit into rectifying the loss of the built environment in the Treme that, you know, was destroyed in the creation of the park. And how do you reconnect then with the neighborhood, and not just have something that's outward facing, but have something that really is alive and part of preservation and rectifying?
I had a really, first and foremost, thank you for all of that. I had a really interesting conversation with my friend recently, Kira Nasser, who helped inform a lot of, you know, she's helped me a lot. And to that point, you know, like taking down the fences would be a start. Allowing it to actually be a real public park, and not a semi-public thing. Being able to give some of that space back to homes. I certainly understand now that, you know, is that going to happen in 2020 and beyond? Probably not. This is, you know, this project is purposely not trying to tackle that, you know, the issue of gentrification, for example, just because you know, there's a lot of factors, and this is already covering enough, right? So it's just about recognition at this point, in the face of gentrification and other things, you know, not necessarily taking a stance to solve to retroactively fix that problem.
Carol, was there something that you wanted to say, Carol?
Is there time for me to I just want to send Brandon to someone I think will really help you as you sort through these ideas, from the idea of, do we need a monument, to the idea of what's authentic culture. And that is Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimblett. I've written it in the chat. She founded performance studies at NYU. She wrote one I think is the most important book in the 90s, Destination Culture, in which she argued that when culture is commodified, it dies, it ceases to live. But here's the thing. She's just returned from 8 years in Prague, where she was the primary consultant for the creation of the Museum of the History of the Polish Jews.
Wow.
So this idea that the monument, as the critics have already said, is sometimes necessary, vitally necessary to create the point that you want to make is critical. And I hope that you will read her and pay attention to the things that she's done, because there's no one, you know, more intellectually keyed into these ideas than she is. So
and it's called,
good.
the name of the book is
Destination Culture. But I want you to see what she did in Prague as well.
Okay, will do. Thank you.
All right, Brandon, thank you so much for a provocative conversation here. This was fantastic. I agree with all the critics. I can't wait to see what's next. There are a few other chats in the chat that you might want to refer to. I think Elizabeth put a couple of things in there as well as Yasushi. So take a look at that and make sure you record the info. So thank you, Brandon. Great job. All right, Casey, are you ready to rock and roll? I think I still need to give you hosting. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Y'all good?
Yes.
And Casey, I'll do the 3 minute, 1 minute in your chat, okay?
Okay, thank you. Can you all see my screen? Yes. And could you give me a thumbs up? Yeah, okay. Hi, I'm Casey Last. I had the pleasure of working with Ben Smith this semester on a thesis called Realizing Legibility, the Construction of Narrative. The thesis analyzed representation as a means of communication in architecture. I did that through looking at the city being a metaphorical place or a non-place that may or may not exist. Architecture is unique in its ability to visually communicate ideas. The project involves research of relevant scholarship in order to create criteria for evaluation of representations. The critique of precedent involved more than just an evaluation of outcomes, successes, and failures, but also a critical look at the techniques employed to achieve those results. The work participates in the field of representation, first as an analytical study, and then as an exploration in employing those methods. If representations are legible, then they are realized. Each slide of this nature is meant to be read as a caption, typically of a drawing. In the context of this presentation, the plaques serve as markers for shifts in scale. At this scale, the subject overview encompasses the framework for the evaluation of research. Deleuze and Guattari were known for writing on the role of the diagram, further stating what they call the abstract machine, that it does not function to represent even something real, but rather constructs a real that is yet to come, a new type of reality. The discipline of architecture operates in this space of a real that is yet to come, as architects do not build buildings, rather design, draw, and represent ideas. Projects superimpose fictions within realities. The nebulous of research is inductive and extensive. It is centered around the topic of the city. This visual bibliography represents a matrix of 4 major categories: research methods, theories of representation, urban theories, and representations of the city. The texts were viewed within the lens of the authors, where Robin Evans from the projected cast and Stan Allen explain the nuances and implications of the role of visual communication and legibility. The fictions of super studios and manifestos of Le Corbusier and Koolhaas mobilized the concepts. The 12 Cautionary Tales was published as 12 stories of ideal cities, accompanied by 1 image to visualize the narrative. Each city is excessive in its absurdity, much like Super Studio's ideas of radical preservation in their project titled Salvages of Italian City Centers. They diagnose the present reality. They access and critique these diagnoses through imaginations of fictional ones. These ideas explore polemic in a way that is satirical with cynical irony. Le Corbusier, on the other hand, presented Plan Voisin in a number of contexts and occasions throughout his career. This too diagnoses the present reality by representing an ideal one, but is evidently not viewed as satirical work. It is conversely avant-garde. Architectural representations, and when I say this, I'm talking specifically about projects and proposals, involve the superimposition of a fiction and a reality. Abundant and diverse, these projects all can be evaluated on their ability to be understood and read. These examples have been pulled from the bibliography from those texts, and they begin to evaluate the projects. Piranesi's etchings of Rome demonstrate a scientific and archaeological perspective of the city, despite them being largely fantastical. They are read as such because they're demonstrated with the same qualities as, for example, Noli's map of Rome, despite its fictional content. 250 years later, the drawings prove relevant content for exploration as Yale School of Architecture with Peter Eisenman, along with Jeff Kipnis and OSU and Aurelian Dogma, explore these same drawings through 3D modeling, utilizing contemporary representational strategies. So why does this matter? This matters because legibility elevates what is shown by raising the question, what is shown showing? I've set out to explore what is embedded in the format and techniques of architectural drawing and representation. The levels of understanding and clarity vary greatly in successes and failures. These are analytical explorations of digital fabrication techniques and materials that vary in content. Utilizing laser cutting for etching and stencil creation, stamps, stacking and physical layering, and after the transition to remote instruction, renderings of models and materials. I've set out to evaluate the techniques of legibility by defining a subset of desired outcomes. The first, legibility, is the larger umbrella category for evaluating successes in visual communication. The image to the left is a photo of a model drawing. Amorphic form denotes water and land. It is evidently a map with lines for street grid and shapes for buildings. Its adjacent and at times dichotomous condition ambiguity allows for the curation of information and less obvious distinctions. This image is a GIF zooming in on a photograph of another model drawing. Again, the contrast of the framing signifies a border or boundary. Perhaps one would recognize that this is some semblance of or reality of Manhattan. Perhaps the transparency of the plexiglass that's been etched and its lines that have been filled with black paint denote streets. Perhaps the physical layering of the model conveys depth, and conversely, it conceals content. Identity is measured by its legibility. So what is viewed is recognizable as it is intended. It varies from obvious caricature to a clear and stateable truth. This model was photographed and then mapped and rendered, superimposed on top of a photograph of a plexi etched surface. The amorphous form protrudes from the surface, denoting what is clearly an island. Its identity, separate from its legibility, is demonstrated as symbolic or representative of a subject, an island, for example, an island, but also a building, a form, etc. Disguise, like ambiguity, conceals that which is not iconic, diagrammatic, or perhaps true. The photographs of these model drawings show elements of recognition to situate, but elements that conceal or mask the identity of the subject. These techniques aid in the construction of the representations in both conceptual and physical manifestations. So some of those techniques are subtraction, addition, disruption, inversion, proportion, and function. Design Earth, in the book Geostories, wrote that drawings argue through the techniques they use and the points of view they choose. Embedded in the structure of architectural drawing and the discipline are certain knowns. This specific scale shift in my project denotes the design where I've tested the techniques to convey polemic, to tell a story through drawing. Like conventional architectural drawing sets, the drawings explore the city at multiple scales in a succession. George Perec's Species of Spaces and Other Pieces is a piece of literature structured using scale shifts to reveal and curate information. While his writing zooms out from the scale of the page to the book, bed, room, building, universe, and those in between, the structure of this project presents 7 scale shifts from city to building. This project is a hypothetical revisualization of Manhattan. It imagines the future, In the spirit of Super Studio's ideas of radical preservation and Le Corbusier's ideal cities, it assumes the following assumptions. Manhattan will face, like everywhere else, irreversible environmental damage. Sea levels rise and the coast will encroach on the prime real estate of Manhattan. Its infrastructure is insufficient and its current form will not survive. Ambitious measures will be taken to preserve the identity of the city. The last remaining undeveloped land lies within Central Park. This is the site for new development, introducing a new Manhattan, the capital, a capitalist capital, a utopian oasis with enough housing for all old residents and room for growth. These symbols, icons, and notations convey certain truths about the proposal. One, the proposal is within the park. Two, the texture hatch lines convey that water exists around the island of Manhattan in a way that is blurred, unclear lines of where the water once was and where it will be. There's a clear semblance of a boundary in the gold fortification around the park. These forms are likely buildings that fortify the new city against pending environmental collapse. The repetitive forms are at the scale of the existing city blocks, and the density within the proposal involves open space. Outside the outside. Outside the outside represents a view into what the city will look like from outside of the city walls. The frame of reference or perspective situates us within the shell of what was once Manhattan. It is ambiguous and dystopian visualization of the outside. What were once large skyscrapers appear small in comparison. Like Le Corbusier, it envisions massive structures. In fact, the inverse building footprint of Plan Voisin, towering 60 stories high, is the new form of these buildings. Le Corbusier explains the destruction of the past due to its present state of crisis. In the spirit of Super Studio's cynicism, however, this plan explores extreme capitalist capital, the capital city. The majority of the park is preserved as such, as you see with a closer look. We can see the fortified wall of buildings with a central spine of icons aligned with the massive building structure, doubling the size of the walled structures. From inside the outside, within the walls of the city, looking at the outside of buildings, we see a quote from Rem Koolhaas, who explains Central Park is the last untouched surface of New York. From within the city walls, we see the landscape and grandeur of the massive structures. Monuments of Old New York. A collection of icons are rebuilt in the new city as monuments. The monuments commemorate what was the old city. These icons are expressive and exaggerated forms of the buildings that used to exist as icons within the city. Flatiron expresses and exaggerates features of the building in the style of Renaissance revival by expressing the windows, whereas the Woolworth's Gothic revival is amplified. The Chrysler building is cartooned as if it's a Jeff Koons balloon dog. Its formal and legible mass of the Chrysler building forms a shell around its cartooned mass. The Downtown Athletic Club is sectioned. It is severed down the center and split apart in order to nod at Koolhaas's Delirious New York writing on the importance of that building section. The Seagram building is elevated in order to emphasize its plaza. The exposed One Liberty Plaza building is meant in its international style against its international style to expose the guts of the building, the structure. And MetLife is branded where the original MetLife building has a multi-story sign that says MetLife, but instead I've copied MetaLife as the glazing along the building facade. Philip Johnson's postmodern AT&T building features the hats of the original building stacked as they decrease in size as you go up. The Hearst Tower is made into an accordion-like shape where it expands and contracts, and 56 Leonard Street is extrapolated with even more protruding forms and balconies. Gary's Beekman Tower is then swelled. Its amorphic form is then stretched to be even more muscly. And the 432 Park Avenue Vignoli Tower, which stands as a tiny footprint, a tall, tiny footprint tower, is then stretched and twisted. A collection of icons are rebuilt in the city, the street and the building. So this emphasizes not only the building, but the building's context within that form. This represents the building cut. The ground floor plane is further distributed when we're zooming in to see that the tower is actually 4 smaller towers. Each quadrant has programmatic differences. There's living for home, working for management, buying and commerce. Living and working reside on the inside of the wall facing the park, and buying and making reside on the outside facing the old shell of what was once New York. The building organization follows a hierarchy that goes from lower to higher, where there's a lower economy to higher penthouse levels with interspersed spaces that follow that same organization. The building plans. Koolhaas describes the skyscraper as a utopian device for the production of unlimited numbers of virgin sites on a single metropolitan location. This building represents the free plan and free section ideas of Le Corbusier, maintaining a structure such that each floor is able to have its own identity. Again, similar to the ground floor site plan, this is just reiterating the locations of each of the towers. The ground floor features a factory, a bazaar or market, various micro housing apartments, an array of cubicles surrounding a central core where there's conference and executive offices. The exemplary middle floor presents a distillery, a mall with large buildings on the outside, large stores on the outside and smaller stores on the inside with an atrium. The housing is single family villas, and the offices are suite style office apartments that have been subdivided. The exemplary large upper floor represents the agricultural production, an example of a concept store or gallery space, a penthouse apartment that has been a retrofit of Mies van der Rohe's Barcelona Pavilion and Brick House, and then an open floor plan so that of a WeWork space, so people are able to come and go as they please and sit and work and also move around the perimeter. These drawings are, I use the study of precedents, contrived information as criteria for analysis. I categorized techniques and attempted to communicate our reality through drawing these 7 scales. The product is not to be a final proposal, and it's not personally ideal. It visualizes dystopia. It is a fiction superimposed in a reality. The narrative itself is interesting, intellectual, informed, but of course it is insignificant. The representational exploration efforts of legibility is what illuminates and realizes. Thank you.
Thank you, Casey. It's Graham. And by way of an introductory question, tell us why the representations are framed and for whom.
So these are framed as if it were an exhibit for an actual thesis presentation. So that kind of goes back to an image that I showed earlier in the presentation, a small sketch that I drew of like what a thesis looks like. Ideally, in the future, I would be able to fabricate these frames and frame drawings in order to exhibit them in that sort of manner.
Just to follow up on that, there was this moment that was almost like a non sequitur in the presentation where you're talking about all these urban textures, and then you mentioned fabrication. And so could you go back to like what you meant by that? Like, it seems like there's a logic of fabrication that's, you're going to make these things, or the desire to make these whole seems like part of the project unsaid. And I just want to add before you go in, because it's clearly inspired by Eisenman's Campo Marzio project that you're going to like recreate it. And what was wonderful about that, it was a huge model covered in gold. Yeah. And so I think to talk a little bit about the physicality of what you want to do in relationship to the theoretical framework would be helpful now.
Yeah. Yeah, so definitely the project has taken on many different forms throughout the year, semester. I kind of consider it a feedback loop going back to further research and studies to like reinform, to correct myself, to ensure like I have credibility in making certain decisions that I make. So the earlier studies, those like digital fabrication techniques, I had kind of started as a jumping off exercise at the beginning of the semester in just employing what are the capabilities of these techniques to communicate certain ideas. How am I able to use stacking of wood pieces, painting them black, and still having them be read as maps? So just, it was more of a play, but an analytical and like a deliberate play with those techniques. And I mean, those techniques informed how I would go about the later work, but the later work is not necessarily in the format, it's digital.
No, I understand that. And I don't mean this as a lament for the project. I'm trying to find like its core conceptual logic, regardless of its embodiment. And I would argue that somehow this is designed as a model. You're talking about the city, you're talking about city logics, but like, it's not the city as the city, it's the city as represented by Corb, the city as represented by Rem. The whole project is like a chess set. Like you design the buildings like chess pieces. And so I think there's a degree of like abstraction and physicality at a certain kind of scale, which is the scale of the model, that so animates the thinking through the project that it doesn't make sense to talk about how this would look from Broadway. It matters like how it would look standing about 3 feet away from it. I mean, I think that's part of what you're getting at. And I think that's a logic of thinking and making and construction that's talking about the city, but actually is talking about a kind of a model or something we would have physical access to.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good and interesting point. And definitely in line with some of the things that I've been trying to talk about and think about. Yeah.
Casey, I think this is a really super fascinating project. I mean, it's definitely steeped in a kind of intellectual pool in which I like to swim. So, I mean, I feel like it's really juicy. I guess I want to maybe start with a question about sort of what you mean by legibility. And I mean, that's a word we often associate with language, right? Legibility is like the degree to which something can be read. And I would contrast that against intelligibility, which is where you can kind of look at something and know it without necessarily requiring the decoding of language. And so, I mean, in my view, like, I mean, one of the kind of primary critiques, well, not in my view, I mean, in like views of like Charles Jenks and Robert Venturi, the critique of modernism was that it became sort of mute, right? That like it became illegible because it no longer utilized a language which people understood. And so that's of course why so many postmodern architects began with the classical language, because it was a ground on which, you know, sort of their manipulations could be read, right? So if you look at Charles Jenks, the language of postmodern architecture, or some of the later issues of AD, which he guest edited, there's all these kind of verbs of manipulation, which are a lot like yours, right? And so it's like, you know, he and you know, his contemporaries did those manipulations often to, you know, the classical language. Of course, the critique there is like, you know, by that time that was only legible by other architects, right? And not like the everyday man. But here you're doing it to something else. You're doing it to iconic buildings. And so just, I mean, sorry, there's a whole bunch of questions at once, but you know, who can read this?
Yeah, thank you. That was
sorry.
Yeah, so I think the first question you asked was like what I think legibility is. And I think that definitely in talking about language is something that I've read about, and it is hard to like articulate what it means to understand something that's visually depicted, but it's the ability to be able to look at something and understand what is trying to be conveyed without the need for additional content. So I think that even in thinking about, well, who would be able to understand this? Well, I can hopefully, I'm hoping that architecture is able to, and through these processes is able to, I've been trying to, I guess, to be able to communicate these ideas that are so clear and evident and legible that it's obvious. Like,
really?
It's so absurd that it's obvious. These buildings are massive. Like, no one would do that.
I don't think so, Casey. I mean, I think the project is great for like precisely the opposite reason that you're arguing for. I think you're dealing with like modes of disciplinary communication. So like, who gets it? I don't know. Most of the people on this chat, maybe. Like, you know, it's like a chess set. When you think about a chess set, the knight doesn't mean anything. The pawn doesn't mean anything. It's a conventionalized mode of knowledge. And so, I don't know. I think what's great is that you're like dealing with logics of the city. You're dealing with logics of fabrication. You're dealing with all these really disciplinary logics and trying to put them in play. I don't think you're going to, I wouldn't want to live in this city, right? But I'd want to be in the space of this room and play around with it and think about design and think about composition and think about the tools architects use to create abstractions. So I think my mom would look at it and say, ooh, shiny.
Yeah.
And then I might look at it and say, ooh, indexicality. And we would learn different things from it.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes a lot of sense. And I do agree, because I've tried to explain this to a lot of people and I've lost them sometimes. So, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
So I'll jump in from a completely different angle. Can you zoom into like those section and plans on the towards the right? So just for the background info, my my primary focus in my professional career was explaining complex geometry condition to contractor. So all drawings that I made was specifically, I mean, literally it's one-to-one, it is what it is kind of drawing. So like complete kind of opposite of your attitude. So actually I'm really interested in the section. So yes, I admit I'm a lot less theoretically uninformed. So I would just like provide a straight sort of architect's practical architect's point of view. So, you know, I mean, there are a number of things like, so, but I think some of the things is not necessarily fair to point out, and it doesn't even like generate a rich discussion. For example, some of your single family residences that's in the middle of the floor plate, that's, you know, obviously there's a discussion of daylight and all that kind of stuff. But like, I would just like close my eyes towards that because it's not about that. But you know, so I think these are great. And I think maybe one thing I could challenge you is that like all the style of your representation and the mode, the tools that you're using to represent, it's very specifically stylized and like very much from, you know, echo to whatever the drawings you can find in Delirious New York. So it's I guess one question I could ask that might be an interesting challenge is that how could you argue that this is from 2020 and not from 1970 or any other era? So one of the things that like, so all these things, different programs smashed up into this sort of overwhelming mass, that's super fascinating. But besides, you know, I could spend hours just looking into these drawings and then maybe like imagine what happens in there. But maybe only trained architects can read into your drawings, plans and sections. So maybe one thing that might be an interesting challenge can be derived from this project is like, what would be a tip, you know, there might be, I don't know, like thousands of people who go through this building if it was there. And I'm pretty sure the journey of each person is completely different. So maybe like sample like 5 completely different personas that would go through this building, and like, you know, maybe for example, like you know, it could be a film or it could be like an Instagram feed of that person's whole day, what happens. So, you know, because I think what's possibly lacking from this is the experiential and narrative aspect of what happens in this. So maybe just sort of series of fragments of what a user might experience and like how they contrast completely differently might be an interesting thing, and then I would mute myself.
Yeah, I definitely think that those were really important points. That is, you know, from the building scale, the building plans, the next kind of scale shift would have been perspectives of building, of rooms, of floors, closer in zooms of moments within the project, which I definitely think will happen when I do it. Just because, yeah, the narrative, I think itself gets built upon each time you shift the scale, and especially the next scale shift being the individual scale where like it follows a person. I think that's like a super important and interesting angle that I should explore.
Casey, it's Graham Owen again. Yasushi has suggested exploring movement through your section, and I think that's an interesting possibility to pursue. It is parallel but not identical to what I was thinking about in your abstract, where you speak of the architectural tropes of the city, scapes, paths, and objects. And I'm intrigued by John's interpretation of the project as a chess set, because a chess set obviously has meaning, as he said, through the paths that give the various pieces their potential. And it has a scape, which is the checkerboard. And the pathway that I'm interested in is the pathway of representation. How did these towers that you show us become what they are? How did they become represented in the way that they are? In the case of OMA, for example, we could understand the representational pathway as proceeding through O.M. Ungers, Salvador Dali, Le Corbusier. So there's a narrative of transformation and representation which could itself be part of the presentation.
I'm sorry, I missed the last statement.
there's a narrative of transformation in representation, which could be part of the thesis presentation. It's an unspoken dimension of the thesis so far.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's an important and an interesting thing to bring up, as that's a slide I deleted like 10 minutes ago.
Uh-oh.
So yeah, that the scapes, paths, and objects, those tropes that I talk about, those were kind of, I started to think about and define what those were when I was doing those technique studies, those fabrication studies, and looking at those as separate layers, and the layers that would be superimposed, and some layers having the ability to shape what the space would be, and others being more submissive to that. So imposing a grid and overlaying objects and buildings on that grid versus having the buildings and have the grid follow those buildings, and playing with those sort of strategies. So that was definitely part of the exploration, and I think that it could definitely be seen more in like the section of the building and in the building, and that kind of it did get lost.
Hi, Casey.
Yeah.
Did you have fun doing this, right?
Yeah.
We can tell. I mean, it's a really, really appealing project. I mean, I don't know how to speak Italian, but I love how it sounds. And this is maybe what could happen with your new language or graphic technique you are trying to show us. I mean, if Kulas, when doing Delirious New York, he built his own language to explain us his ideal city, there's the opposite example. If you think about Made in Tokyo book, they had the city and they developed the language to tell that story. But at the end of your let's say dictionary, which is this last project, I think you quit too quick from your game. I wish you could have developed the section or the plans of the objects you showed us before by following the same technique, which is using another sections and another parts of known buildings instead of trying to develop this more neutral building, which is just doubling the size of what's going on in the border of your project. I think you could have been even more radical trying to explain what this speculative city could be. But just saying that, I think that the last part of your project, when you try to define an exact and precise architecture, I think for me it's not the best part of your project. But apart from that, congrats, because I love the graphics, and I think you have found that kind of language that if you develop and with more detail, you can get from the urban scale to the little small scale in architecture. So congrats.
Oh, thank you so much.
I think, in the interest of time, we probably need to keep moving. Casey, do you have a short response to that?
No, just thank you. This was all really helpful information, and yeah, I definitely am excited to continue and see where it goes.
All right, well, we need to keep moving here. Seneca, are you ready to rock and roll? Well, Casey, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. It's been a real pleasure working with you this last year. So congratulations. We'll keep talking. Seneca.
Yep, I'm ready. All right. Hi, my name is Seneca Gray. My thesis advisor was Ann Yoakum. My thesis has been titled Toward a blank for this whole year, to be determined what the blank is. So this thesis analyzes the success of future-based architecture theory, specifically within the Torda paradigm, by assessing the subsequent built environments in an attempt to better advise contemporary architecture design practice. This investigation seeks to illuminate architecture's stake in social, cultural, and environmental progress as a future-driven discipline. It tests seminal written work and built work by Le Corbusier against nearly 100 years of succeeding Torda theorists by interpreting those core points into new prototypes. Once produced, the prototypes can be assessed in a self-referential matrix based on my own Torda points. Le Corbusier penned his seminal text toward a new architecture in 1923. It's a revolutionary declaration claiming contemporary architecture is at a pivotal moment in history and must decide how design practice should move into the future. Since this publication, other theorists interested in future proposals adapted toward a nomenclature. The proposition offers simultaneous indication of activity and destination. A direct lineage of reference can be traced through two of the succeeding examples, Kenneth Frampton's Toward a Critical Regionalism in 1981 and Kate Orff's Toward an Urban Ecology in 2016. In 1971, C.S. Holing and Gordon Oriens published Toward an Urban Ecology as an article, making it the first Torda divergent after Le Corbusier's own, and the first to change the discipline of the application. Since then, architecture and landscape future-based theories have developed simultaneously. Eventually, Kate Orff's publication of Toward an Urban Ecology in 2016 reunited landscape and architecture as a joint effort, solidifying the shared paradigm between both landscape and architecture disciplines. From here, architecture must move forward and embraced with its landscape counterpart by applying their progressive principles to our own theory and design practice.
Seneca, I sorry to interrupt. Your first slide hasn't advanced yet. Have you been advancing slides on your end?
I've only gone one slide, so that's pretty lucky.
I just wanted to check.
Let's see.
If you may need to reshare.
And get at it through your desktop, not through Acrobat.
Okay, I'll try doing that.
I've had that problem about 20 times.
Thanks, Judith.
Maybe just try cycling quick. Yep, now it's cycling, at least for me.
Excellent. This is the beautiful image you all have been missing. So the semantics of Torda indicates an actionable meaning and applicable framework. Toward as in a destination, moving away from, revitalization of, or facing. As an action, toward has a relation with the passage of time. As a governing word in the title, it implies the subject is in a state of dynamic flux. The A indicates singularity, a unit, a united collective, or an absolute. It has memory in the sense that the destination remembers or holds a direct relationship with the previous state of being. Now that Torda has been identified as a paradigm, in order for it to survive, it must become a united collective. Contemporary architecture practice is always in a dynamic state of movement toward a future while remaining rooted in its past phases. Torda should not be solution-based. Instead, it is an evolving cycle of being timely rather than timeless. My application thrusts the last 100 years of these future-based theories into a framework to sustain itself. Le Corbusier's Toward a New Architecture outlines 5 points of formal attributes: the pilotis, the free plan, the free facade, horizontal windows, and roof gardens. He declares architecture will usher society into the industrial age. Architecture mimics society's machine state of mind and is removed from but manufactures nature. It is an architecture or revolution. Frampton's Toward a Critical Regionalism outlines 6 points for an architecture of resistance. As a historian, he critiques where the contemporary architecture is postmodern. However, how it has arrived there, what is wrong with it. He establishes the need to resist it and sets up why critical regionalism is a preferable design strategy to optimize the collective social reality. Formal priorities can be tweezed out of his works, and these include materiality, form, tectonics, readability, and fenestration for light. Orff's Toward an Urban Ecology outlines 4 points in her self-declared part manifesto monograph manual based on the projects her firm Scape has pursued: revive, cohabit, engage, and scale. These are a method of application for practitioners who want to operate under the acknowledgement of multidisciplinary action, that it provides strength, uncertainty is a constant, and design can aid the sustainability of natural systems. Each has different application agendas. Corbusier is arguing for a singular formula with universal approach. Frampton argues for an application zones or regions to determine the formula, and Orff's formulas are contingent on the communities within the application. The objective of assessment is derived from within the paradigm. Embedded within the collection of works are 3 shared phenomena and 3 building attributes. The phenomena, time, memory, and dynamics, interpreted as ecology, are ways the built environment is entangled with the constant experience of uncertain living systems beyond architecture's control. These comprise the first 3 points. The theories of each concerned with time, each identifying past, presents, and futures with analyses, hypotheses, and suggestions to reflect, mark, and change. It is generally a binary progression. This framework is also known as historical time. The second point, memory, refers to context or a network of associations. The built environment records aspects of culture and history, a mnemonic device weaving physical memory. The experience of memory relies on propriety and conscious existence through these spaces. The theorists have all responded to their contexts. The third point, ecology, is the inherent dynamic network beyond the built environment. While ecology affects both landscape and architecture discourse, the former has taken steps to include it in their future-based theories. The Landscape Architecture Foundation released a call to action, the new Landscape Declaration for the 21st Century in 2017, to boldly set the profession in the entanglement of the human and non-beings and processes. The call to action directs the landscape architecture discipline across professional, academic, and practical institutions on a path that to remain more than relevant, to remain necessary by formally acknowledging the dynamics of the global network. Like Orff shows, ecology is a necessary tool to respond to climate change, biodiversity loss, social inequalities, and global mass consumption of depleted resources. Architecture needs to adapt landscape architecture's ecological practices because it shares these contexts. The architecture attributes identified compose the last 3 points. Tectonics, performance, and context are typical integral characteristics of design. These attributes escape the burdens of the phenomena because they have constantly existed within design practice. Tectonic, a notable feature of Frampton's theory, addresses how the architecture prototype is conducted through craft, material, assembly, and form. Performance featured strongest in Corbusier's theory, constitutes what motivates the prototype's aspirations, such as innovation of material, technology application, and functional evolution. Context, a quintessential attribute of Orff's theory, acknowledges when, where, and for who the prototype is designed. Social networks, behaviors, events, and the design's contributions of context affect design's reception and reputation. The phenomena and attributes can be set into a self-referential matrix of assessment to determine the success of projects. The phenomena are on one axis and the attributes are on the cross-reference axis. To the right are examples of how the matrix framework can produce design. Memory and tectonic advocates for the design of layers, phenomenal and literal. Layers of program, elements, and experiences can be treated across horizontal, vertical, and depth directions of the building. Ecology plus performance can advocate for solar carving, a form treatment to adjust fenestration and ground plane daylighting for summer solstice and winter solstice sun angles in mind. This can greatly impact energy use and human comfort of building operations. The Unité de Habitation by Le Corbusier was a monumental prototype of his 5 points. The Unité in France, modeled here, is set up off the ground on concrete pilotis. The structural system allows for a free plan. The free facade is designed as loggias with glazing set back from the perimeter. While the roof is not necessarily a living garden, it is sculpted, houses the building's daycare, and provides a fresh air communal space. To set up my own Torta framework, the Unité must first be reimagined in Frampton and Orff's points, and then again through the matrix. The building's mass, unit density, and mixed use as a city within a city is to be maintained throughout. Le Corbusier's Unité was meant to be and was built in multiple cities. Placing the Unité prototype in a new city offers my hypothesis a chance to push the integrity of each theory's points. St. Louis traditionally has definitive architecture characteristics, as well as deep wells of phenomena experiences. Its location along the Mississippi River provided natural clay and slate for bricks and kilns. The site is the same as they demolished Pruitt-Igoe. Here, Le Corbusier's Unité, placed on the site, is off the street and oriented directly in the north-south axis. To deconstruct the Unité, the building is divided vertically to match the height of the existing context. The particularities of light and climate suggest the forms bend to alter the direct cardinal direction of sunlight. According to Frampton, successful place form has defined volumetric domains. For the crux of the forms become communal atriums, and the residential hallways become daylit gallerias. It is also clearly bounded, and the generation of this form is helped by the perimeter of the urban block. There are 3 facades for this prototype. Structurally founded in brick, the residential units mimic the traditional brick housing similar to its context. For shading, the communal atriums offer an opportunity for glazing, but execute vertical panels for shading and vegetation. The interior galleria also remains brick, but the interior walkways are protected by the glass vaulted ceiling demonstrated in the section. Orff's 4 points are applied to the site as a landscape architect might be hired for. Ecotones of the St. Louis area are applied as rooms for organizing the site. Pathways connect the habitats with attention to structure and program. Spaces must alter in levels of engagement in both what the human population can contribute and what ecology can offer back. Ecotones are defined as changes in vegetation, hydrology, and animal diversity. These characteristics are best for local species to thrive. Pathways are as follows. Learn provides easy walking with permeable but hard surfaces, seating options, and function as primary transition and connectivity zones. Play are larger swaths of activity for formal walkways and seating, here to engage hyper-directionality. Explore carves out spaces for pastoral wandering and is softer pathway coverings, still provides seating but has minimal human intervention. The pathways lattice across the ecotones to provide dynamic spaces for each room. The ecotones are associated with animals tied to its existence in St. Louis. The three-toed box turtle is the official state reptile of Missouri. There is a program in the city park to monitor their population and migration habits. The box turtle resides in the pond ecotone. The monarch butterfly passes through St. Louis twice a year for their annual migrations. The field ecotone provides them refuge and sustenance. Forest Park is the home to great horned owls. The local celebrity is Charles and his mate Danielle. There are competing owls in the city limits, but Charles and Danielle have been the subject of local birdwatcher Mark Glenshaw's blog since 2009. Additional ecotones to support the species could reduce hunting competition. The final stage of the hypothesis is to exercise the matrix across the prototype. Following the framework, memory and tectonic keeps the building's materiality as brick. Ecology and performance drive the massing shifts. For each floor becomes offset along the north-south axis carved by the summer solstice sun angle. This is the moment of innovation and future-based progress. The acute angled exterior requires a new way to execute brickwork. While this thesis does not calculate the practicality of such a wall, it is declaring that the time to develop it is pertinent. Finally, architecture must accept landscape theories into practice, breaking the barrier created by the building, dividing the exterior and interior outdoor spaces, gives rooms and pathways an integral characteristic of the architecture. In examination of the form's formal moves, unique sections become a product. The top left section is the most aligned with the southern direction and was therefore the sun-angled driver. Notably, the section to its right is perfectly east-west and has remained perpendicular to the ground plane. The facades have emerged all of different characteristics of the Frampton facades into one form. They remain brick. The angle of both the wall and the modular rhombuses create the necessary solar carve in both the southern angle, and it helps the east and west sunlight. The fenestration study executes an idiosyncratic rhythm, but must maintain a certain standard of transparency percentage unit. In this case, each unit on each floor has at least 3 windows. The form aggregation is also applied to the roof, and those sunlights now daylight the interior circulation galleria. With the breakdown of the prototype's boundary, the ecotone rooms and pathways can be designed within the building's designated area. The pathways become for the fauna and flora as well as the human occupants. The dynamics across the site are heightened, diversified, and dispersed. The boundaries between the pathways of the programs are blurred, but safety for each ecotone's habitat, some designation remains intact. With the paradigm identified and challenged, Twarda theories must no longer be a collection of individual visions. It is now operative as a collective unit. To do this, the 3 phenomena, my first 3 points, must be adjusted. Time becomes social time, a sociology term that considers an ahistorical or a cyclical flow. Flows are seemingly individual events that over time form a pattern through linked means of production. This can be applied in architecture like the diagram to the left. The practitioner designs in present time. They are positioned within present time spatial and social contexts. Those contexts are established in a past time, thus conflating the past with the present. Intrinsically, the practitioner's design is intended for and realized in a future time. Therefore, the future is brought into the present as well. This application demands for a constant critique of the past and the future to exist within the present action. Memory becomes collective memory, another sociology term. Collective memory honors the experiences of the individual, but reinforces the importance of sharing and supporting the memories of others. The action links the individuals in a network where memories become communal. Since collective memory operates like social time, past and future, constantly existing in the present, it must motivate and shape practitioners' actions. Ecology, while inherently dynamic, must also be applied to architecture's form and work on from conception with the progress of living systems as important as the longevity of the built form. Thank you for your time.
I'll just jump in. I think it's a fantastically formatted thesis project in that there's a connection between a theoretical trope and some design results. And so in that sense, I just want to commend you. Having said that, I want to take exception with what you actually believe.
Okay.
So I think you've set this framework. I guess I'd start that out by just talking about, could you just describe this relationship between this theoretical observation you make about the towards as a kind of model and how that because it seems like in the towards there's a variety of towards So there might be an outline of how it functions temporally, but for very different ideologies. You seem to go through all of those and end up with an ideology that's quite nice. I wonder if there were other towards that weren't so nice and might engender different products. So you choose in there somewhere. You choose the towards that you want, as opposed to the towards Jeff Kipnis wants, or the towards other people want that aren't in your constellation. So could you just talk about that, the theoretical idea of towards versus what you decided to take?
Yeah, so I have been fascinated by the quantity of how many of these towards exist. I think back at the timeline, more and more have been produced more recently. And I think that is because that beginning of a title has sort of become canonical. And by using that verbatim, you're already giving your article or your theories kind of a leg up by using that same concept. There were many varieties of topics. So there was a torta for computer science and a torta for I think nomadic architecture. So that's why I spent a lot of time sort of delving into the semantics of what torta could mean. I think all of the theories are identifying what was the past and are trying to identify how they want to move into a future destination. I focused on these three specifically because I was interested in memory, time, and ecology. And those three concepts actually brought me to the Torta article, specifically critical regionalism. And from there, I was able to, I was led to look into the tortas in general.
I mean, just to be super clear, because I think it's a well-stated point, you're giving, that's a process answer. I was interested in this, and so I found that. So I found the beginning by starting from the end. And my only point is the towards idea, which I think is super profound, doesn't equal the towards that you're interested in. You sort of have to cherry pick the towards that you find useful and leave aside the other ones. And so I think the thesis has two parts, this sort of discursive observation and then a design proposal, which has its own kind of ethos.
Certainly.
Well, yeah, and if I could jump in, I mean, I'm also a little skeptical. I mean, so yeah, I guess I want to start by saying I agree that, I mean, I appreciate the kind of deep dive you've done into, three important texts and the way that you've kind of laid out the argument. But I'm super skeptical that these three values that you have on the side are like really anywhere in the thing that you've designed. And I say that because, I mean, you've chosen such sort of like you haven't chosen like a kind of neutral like starting place. I mean, you've chosen like Corps Unité, which was revolutionary for like a lot of reasons. And then you've chosen the site of Pruitt-Igoe, and your proposal like doesn't deal with hardly any of like the actual kind of history or architectural character of either of those two sites that I can tell. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, exactly. So I would say the architectural attribute that I dealt with the least was that context, and that's the who, when, and where. And a lot of why I struggled with that was because you should engage with the community and the people that are there, and I just didn't have that access as a student not in St. Louis. So I didn't want to tread and assume anything for those attributes in that exploration. So I specifically stayed away from those realizations.
I mean, but beyond the sort of like the people in the current context, I mean, like the Pruitt-Igoe, the project, I mean, the kind of the whole history of like, I mean, Charles Jenks, of course, like, points to the failure of that project as like the death knell of modern architecture. I mean, there have been like books and documentaries about it. I mean, it's quite possible to know like a lot about that site. And so, I mean, why not deal with that history?
Not enough time in the semester. I know that's not a great answer, but I was aware and I placed it on that site for the reason to evoke, memory. Collective memory is completely a part of that. And it's exciting that you latched onto it because it was supposed to be investigative.
Well, I would say then definitely return to it because it's such a, it's such, I mean, you've just chosen like such a kind of like provocative context, and it's like, I just want to see a little bit of that come through in the project, and hopefully you'll have time, I mean, this summer, take a break, have a rest, go back to it, I would say.
Thank you.
I was very much struck by the design project, which I had not seen earlier when I first saw your thesis, what feels like months and months ago. And I think it's fascinating, given I acknowledge the criticism that you just received, but I was wondering why Le Corbusier's Unité had to be erased completely. I mean, there are some things about it that I would think because I thought it was a really interesting starting point, but it's completely unrecognizable in the transformation. For example, the complex section of the units that promoted certain kinds of relationships, the relationship to the ground, though simplistic in the Piloty approach, is equally simplistic in yours, where this thing just thuds onto the ground. And given your complex or your very rich working of the ground, that seems like a missed opportunity. So I guess I fear that you despise Le Corbusier greatly because he hasn't even left any little shred of his approach.
No, you make a great point. I think, especially the breaking of the perimeter I could have reintroduced the Piloty's or the Corbusier's idea of raising off the ground. It's a very good formal point.
I think what we have on the screen for me is a tool. It's a design tool. So I would have loved that you have made a previous analysis to the Unité d'Habitation using this matrix and see what parts of it are inside your matrix and trying to use them. That's one way to develop a project. And another one is not just erasing and creating with known elements, but trying to define your own context in a more theoretical way. I think you try to build one single project, and that's for me what makes your thesis divided in two very separate parts. think there's something in between that could be done. Maybe just analyzing, I don't know, 5, 6, 10 case studies and see if it works. And if it works, how can it be applied into building one?
Yeah, I would love to keep this as a tool. Specifically, I call it a framework. And I hope it's applicable. I mean, like Corbusier, who wanted the unité to be universal. Hopefully this can somehow find access for multiple kinds of analyses.
Would you go back to the building design slides? Or maybe even the site, because I feel like that's something that, oh gosh, yeah, the rhombus is super interesting. It seems as though part of the project, you know, wants to make a case for like a kind of tighter, you know, a tighter connection between architecture and landscape. And I guess maybe one question is like, how does your project sort of exemplify that push in a way that is maybe different from the way that, you know, architects approach it already?
Yeah, I know I kind of make some big suggestions that we need to work with landscape architecture much more closely, and how does ecology become connected with, usually our material is so inanimate. Can that help boost your local ecology? I think that's mostly where I'm going with this. Trying to think about, rather than plopping in a site and designing around, you actually design throughout and with.
Yeah, I just want to, like, Seneca, I think it's a great project. I think the answers are kind of Pollyanna. And so I want to push back on the detail of the project that I think is a real accomplishment. So I think there's moments like when you show the sections and frankly, the facade elevation, I think that's like extraordinarily good design. And frankly, like much more as a drawing and as a design, much more calibrated to specific inputs. Like for me, this is the proof of concept here, is that like you can implement the design regime that like changes the physical mass into something that you think is more productive. Like I think that's really fantastic. And I wrote a little comment in the blurb about like, I just feel like more of the pages should be like this, so we have a kind of clear demonstration, because in one way you're trying to like make it sound like we should be more humanitarian, more connected to the environment, which I think are an ethos. But I think the more that you can demonstrate like what the series of inputs are and how that sort of ethos gets implemented in form, because I think the starting with the unité is fantastic. Like what a great primitive to start with. But then like every move should be like, I don't know, rationally dismantling that thing to make it this new thing that you want. Like I would agree with Judith, your first move, you lost me already because I didn't know like what happened to it. Like it seems to lose all of its characters and becomes another thing. And I think you set up the towards it's such a tight argument. So I feel like every move has to be like chapter and verse from Orff, from Frampton, from back to Corb, maybe reread some way. And it's just like, the whole thing is just a lineage or a litany of like reconceptualizing what those meanings are. I think that's where the project's like so strong.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I like the rigor.
And also think about the scale of the projects you try to build with this matrix. If it's urban scale, just the building, maybe the interior, how that matrix can be modified or make it bigger to solve all those scales if you want.
Hey, Seneca, it's Carol. Can you hear me?
Hi, Carol, I
Hi.
can.
Hi. Okay, so I want to apologize to Elizabeth because maybe she said all this anyway, and I had to answer a phone call really quickly. But I, in the way that I very much appreciated you really studied how these ecotones and zones reflected the place that is St. Louis. Then, you know, I would have loved to have seen you look at the whole issue of the relationship between the Pruitt-Igoe buildings and Le Corbusier's Habitation. And there are fantastic films, maybe you've watched them, about Pruitt-Igoe and the sociability that was created there, the way people feel about it in retrospect. So your whole idea of collective memory and the sociability of that building, which people actually remember fondly, could be poured into this. And, you know, that's not really a design research question so much as it is a qualitative social science research question. But because you've introduced these terms from social science research and sociology, you know, if going forward, I would love to see you work on that idea as well. And I suppose that there probably, you know, this convergence between L'Habitation and Pruitt-Igoe, or the new Pruitt-Igoe, whatever it is, could also be followed through in Marseille. You know, this whole idea of how does a building like that become home, really, and habitat. So thank you.
Thank you, Carol. I'm all about the multidisciplinary research, so I will definitely continue.
But Seneca, I think we have to keep moving on, unless if there's any final comments. But I thought this was a great discussion, and you know, fantastic work, Seneca. Looking forward to seeing what's next.
Thank you, everyone.
Congratulations.
All right, Lucy, I think you are our last presentation of the day. There you are on my screen, back in the Sackler wing, I see. Fantastic. All right, are you ready to roll?
Yes, but could you make me...
oh, you don't have it. Okay, yeah. You should have it now.
Okay, perfect.
And Yasushi, he might be here, he might not be. He may have to leave, but he did say, Lucy, he'll provide you some feedback if he misses the presentation.
Okay.
Oh, I guess he is there.
Alrighty. So the United States is in one of the most severe drug-related crises in its history. And as a result, a new typology is being introduced, the overdose prevention site. OPSs are low-barrier public facilities open to provide safe, clean, stigma-free environments for drug users to ingest pre-obtained drugs under supervision. Currently, there are 120 overdose prevention sites located in 10 countries. Since the opening of the first legal site in 1986, there have been no overdose fatalities reported in an overdose prevention site. As recent US legislation lays groundwork towards their actualization in the United States, this project will take several approaches to providing an architectural definition for this new typology. In this way, architectural research can be used to navigate the physical safety of drug using communities and contribute to the development of a typology that will combat the largest drug-related public health crisis of our time. The thesis project consists of 3 parts: the manual, the fix, and the exhibition. Hilary Sample, in her 2012 piece, Emergency Urbanism and Preventative Architecture, argues that during public health epidemics, public health emergencies, design conventions are thwarted in ways that subvert the order they were naturally supposed to uphold. Changing healthcare needs modulate design in the pursuit of saving lives. The manual sets out to cultivate a set of deliberate strategies that clarify means for architects to responsibly contribute to conversations regarding health and the built environment. It examines the overdose prevention site as a currently illegal typology of healthcare design to discuss the architect's potential for advocacy in cultivating the physical structures that combat public health epidemics. Constructing architectural research in advance of legislation affirms the discipline belongs at the table as collaborator in the design of healthcare environments, thus ensuring burden not fall on already overtaxed public health activists or predatory political agencies. The pursuit to legalize an illegal typology takes a stance in the largest public health crisis of our time, affirming architecture is never neutral, it either hurts or heals. The future of this manual as a printed document is also supposed to serve as a guide for architects and to be used as a bit of a cheat sheet in designing overdose prevention sites. Its present purpose for this thesis project is to cultivate a set of criteria to inform the thesis design. Here we can go through a couple parts as a means of exploring my design methodology. So to begin, I've worked at a series of definitions. So what is an overdose prevention site? An OPS exists as any place where a community organization of staff or volunteers monitor the consciousness of people who inject, smoke, or snort drugs. Varying in name and slight programmatic nuance, overdose prevention sites, supervised injection sites, and drug consumption rooms are all spaces where users ingest pre-obtained drugs under supervision. Crucially, they carry naloxone, an FDA-approved medication on the WHO's list of essential drugs that reverses heroin and prescription opioid overdoses. Now with medications like naloxone, drug overdoses caught immediately are reversible, and these deaths are preventable. Much of the research being used by policy and legal professionals to push forward support of services come from the medical community. However, in the cultivation of overdose prevention sites, it's important to question whether the medical community should be de facto clientele. Historically, some health institutions have been employed to systematically criminalize and rehabilitate people in active drug use, often providing ineffectual and temporary cures, resulting in both lack of trust and treatment by the medical authority. This project will explore how architecture can act as moderator between drug users as the primary client and healthcare professionals as the service operator. Harm reduction can be understood as practices that broadly attempt to minimize the risks associated with drug use. It informs policies that encapsulate a spectrum of tactics for safer drug use, safe supply, and drug substitutions that meet users where they are at. Medical professionals have begun to expatiate harm reduction practices in conjunction with drug recovery and rehabilitation programs to support an urgent shift in focus towards life-saving and life safety. The overdose crisis has manifested a series of typologies organized here in a spectrum of most to least effective as understood by drug user organizations. Here they all have different levels of effectiveness in relation to their scale, mobility, and spatial occupation. The tent is an expedient temporary stopgap, small, fairly mobile with low spatial occupation. The van serves as a mobile response, which is highly effective in rural communities, small, extremely mobile with multiple spatial occupations. The room is a multi-scalar approach within an existing building, no mobility, low spatial occupation. The building, a full facility dedicated to supervised consumption, large scale, no mobility, and high spatial occupation. And finally, safe supply, which refers to the legal dissemination of unadulterated drugs of known quality and origin, providing a continued safe supply of opioids and stimulants. This is a small scale response with high mobility and low occupation. OPS facilities have 5 primary programmatic zones: an intake area, injection area, or a fix, a chill room, as well as storage for harm reduction supplies and administration. As well, washrooms need to be specifically designed with mechanical lock overrides and doors that swing out, depending on layout, such that if someone is having an overdose in the washroom, they're still accessible for resuscitation. I've performed a series of case studies through a grant that I received last summer and was able to visit sites in Amsterdam, Vancouver, a second one in Vancouver, one in Toronto, and one in Copenhagen. Here, the plans have been drawn and are ordered in terms of lobby, fix, chill, and storage. Generally, people move from yellow to red to blue with access to green or gray as needed. I've also created an inventory, which I've called furniture, fixes, and equipment. Furniture refers to the furniture that is used within the site in areas of consumption, as well as in areas of, as well as in the rest of the programmatic zones. And in the manual, I talk a little bit about how those things should be like easily wipeable, non-porous surfaces. The fixes is a list of harm reduction supplies provided for use on site or to take away. The equipment refers to the necessary medical and mechanical equipment required, including specific HVAC systems, as well as oxygen tanks, medical clinic equipment, and foot baths. Recommendations provided from the manual. Overdose prevention services should embrace a program that eliminates barriers to access and facilitates maximal usage by the clientele. With 80% of overdose deaths occurring in the home of people who use drugs, an OPS must be welcoming, pleasurable, and attractive to drug users. They should seek for what I could call facade honesty. They serve as a form of urban property that spatializes the rights of drug users. Visibility is paramount in overdose prevention services, and intentionality of site and clarity of facade ensures users will know how and where to access the site and ensures communication that the building is for them. OPS sites should navigate public-private relationships in which drug users are able to enter a publicly accessible private space without the lingering fear of public exposure. It striates the drug consumption experience as a means of providing formal organization and intentional interaction among employees and users. It provides smooth lines of possibility and subversion to escape scrutiny and intervention of city authorities. Overdose prevention sites should also work towards cultural safety and should be designed should be places where designers, staff, and institutional authority are not just culturally sensitive or culturally competent. Architectural interventions must clearly acknowledge the history of inequity drug users have experienced in the built environment, from disciplinary architecture used to prevent and enforce behaviors, prison architecture used to supervise and punish, and hostile architecture that limits comfort and movement. Cultural safety in architecture would not only acknowledge the way in which it has historically been used to control and enforce behaviors, but to challenge norms of the built environment challenge norms of the built environment that increase danger for drug users. The pleasure paradox. Design as a field particularly concerned with qualities like beauty, pleasure, and delight can be employed to address the pleasure paradox in public health research, in which pleasure is an under-recognized and underappreciated element of design for drug use. A focus on pleasure and harm reduction beyond neoliberal ideas of moderate consumption can operationalize pleasure in the drug consumption room, as the pleasures of drug use serve as important motivator and mediator of accessibility. And understanding of pleasure also serves as a means of understanding the embodied experience and interactions of people who use drugs that will honestly inform the design process. The next part of the project is called the Fix, which uses the small box pharmacy typology as a means of applying and testing the research performed in the manual. The typology of the small box bears the load of market forces, political treaties, consumer science, and technical innovation, each providing the opportunistic thinker with a diverse set of possibilities for change. I'm an opportunistic thinker, as much as the commercialization of pharmacology has also been opportunistic. Walgreens was chosen as part of what I'm calling the Opioid Reparations Fund, in which for the purpose of this project, they will be donating a portion of their stores. OPS sites and the small box pharmacies are both typologies rooted in a physical spatialization of where drugs are located in the city and are demonstrative of society's changing relationships with the social acceptability of drug use. It also felt appropriate for this project to occupy a pre-existing building, as in the sites I visited, even if standalone, they have been acquired through rental and renovation. Walgreens, as part of the small box typology, is also what I think of as a mute typology. It's well known and familiar by their ubiquity and by experience, but also unremarkable and easily manipulated. On top of that, 6 million people visit Walgreens every day, and 78% of Americans live within 5 miles of a Walgreens. The first of my interventions is what I call the Mini. It's located in the Skid Row neighborhood of Los Angeles. It is the smallest of my interventions. It takes place in an unused front facade corner of the building, which is a design that's been dedicated to safe supply, which has the lowest spatial occupation with the highest result and is kind of the most future forward of the propositions. Here, users are able to enter and exit through a cyclical motion to pick up their safe supply of drugs. It is a bit of a parasite onto the site, as it holds kind of no formal relationship to the site, however, is kind of housed inside and hidden. And here's the changes as seen through the elevation. The next site is the integrated model, which integrates an overdose prevention site into the pharmacy. So here we have a plan of the original floor plan as well as the integration. And it's taken over the 1 hour photo as well as a large refrigerator and a little bit of the storage. So to zoom in a little bit closer, to begin, there's the lobby, which moves to the fix, which moves around to the chill area. In the center core are the washrooms, the clinic space, some office and meeting rooms, and then you loop back through to exit at the front. There's entry through both the pharmacy and through a separate entrance, which felt important in an integrated model. The third of my interventions, oh, sorry, here's the elevation of the integrated model. The final of my takeovers is the takeover, which is located in the Kensington area of Philadelphia. So this area is the same area where Safe House is located, which is likely to be the first overdose prevention site in the United States. So in this, I've done a full takeover of the Walgreens and tried to bring forward the 5 typologies that I introduced in the manual into one building. And so in this example, you begin in the lobby. As you move towards the back of the building, not diagonally, but if you take a right, I guess, you enter into the women's only facility. So this operates as part of a room within a greater service. Then diagonally, you move through into a series of different fixed rooms with different possibility for furniture organization and use. For different kind of drug consumption experiences, you move back into the chill area. Clinics are located on kind of that dead bearing wall. Safe supply is located at this entrance at the back. And then there's van loading and harm reduction supply storage at the part of the facade. And then here's the new elevation. Finally, the exhibition. So here the most unique part of the Walgreens typology has been extracted. The sign boxes perched atop a Walgreens as a hat are often designed as per their regional vernacular and have been donated as part of the Opioid Reparations Fund. The boxes here are composed into an exhibition that explores what the Canadian Centre for Architecture's 2012 exhibition called A Demedicalization Process that unclouds moralist conceptions of health in architecture such that the architecture can recover one's capacity to be critical with respect to public health policies, questioning the medicalized forms of design that are meant to treat the sick body. The demedicalization process, along with a desire to use design as a means of addressing the pleasure paradox and harm reduction, inform the final part of the project, an exhibition in the Met Museum. So here is the original floor plan and section of the Met. Here is the occupation of tourism in the Met, which receives about 7 million visitors a year. Here is the spatial occupation of the Met Gala, an annual event that's characterized by pomp and excess. Here is the spatial occupation as a protest and is a representation of the activist organization Payne's protest within the Met Museum a couple years ago. Here's an overlay of all three together. And then the new plan in section and an example of my exhibition, The Pleasure Paradox, which retains many parts of the Temple of Dendar, however, does remove it. So it retains the offering hall as an area of distributing harm reduction supplies, a series of sanctuaries, which operated as a bit of an annotated bibliography to my research, and homage to some of the modern architects and different architects that have either addressed health or addressed material play. And then the crypt of queer roots, which is the roots of the harm reduction movement.
Lucy, are you finished with the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I can go to this slide set.
Lucy, could you elaborate a bit on your choice of that particular exhibit space?
So I chose that exhibit space through because of as part of it's owned by the Sackler family, and so I chose it because of the protests that were going on about the Sacklers forfeiting or museums forfeiting dollars from the Sackler family and not accepting money from pharmaceutical companies who have benefited from the opioid crisis. So I tried to take pre-existing spaces and materials of the world from people who have benefited from the opioid crisis and then manipulate them. And it felt appropriately in line with Nan Goldin and Payne's protests.
It seems there are two kinds of culpability that you're tackling, and I want to commend you for the extremely clear graphics in which you're presenting that examination. But tell us more about the differences that you see between the two types of culpability, Walgreens and Sacklers, and how your architectural resolution presents us with a potential resolution of culpabilities.
I mean, I think that the nature of an exhibition space is that it's able to kind of teach and play and be bombastic. And so I think that I'm trying to that is a zone of material play, and it's a zone of thinking about this medicalization process of consumption spaces and kind of subvert that and play with the overdose prevention site as kind of a series of materials and a series of kind of almost different typologies than just clinic. Whereas the Walgreens, which is like a functioning site, highly ubiquitous and easily accessible, feels like the appropriate location for the most practical response that would reach the most people.
I mean, I have to say, I think it's like an overwhelming project in a certain way. And I mean that as a compliment, like in terms of the manual versus the fix versus the final result. I think there's a lot of intelligence and a lot of work that's taken place within it. So I think that's great. I mean, just to be honest, I guess I'm curious, like at this final image that you have showing here, I'm trying to understand what its relationship, I mean, it's a thesis project. Nobody's building anything today. We're just going to talk about the ideas, but I'm trying to understand in your final result, like where does it sit in relationship to enactment of like a new regime of pleasure or new protocols? And where is it like a critical project, a kind of temporary index of where things are right now? So, and I mean that to say like the building's quite interesting. It seems far too complex and wrought to be an exhibition. it seems a renovation. And once it's a renovation, then there's questions about like, well, is it still just a museum? Is it a youth center? Should it penetrate that famous glazed wall and have a new, you know what I mean? There's other things if it's a permanent change, or is it like a kind of, I don't know, and a reflecting image of the way things are right now, or is it pointing to a new condition?
I mean, I think I see it as a bit more of a reflective image and a way and a means of kind of like I think ideally, I mean, in my greater like political understanding of the world, like we would receive safe supply, and overdose prevention sites could be used for like as community centers and less like health facilities. And so this is like it is a temporary exhibition in my like political hopes that it's a temporary situation. But I do hope that it opens a certain like reflexivity about like how architects deal and approach with health, as well as like a didactic like participatory exhibition that allows people to interact with architecture and with like ideas of spaces that would be good to be high in, from like almost a like family friendly or like museum perspective.
I think that's fair. I just want to add one more point, because you're talking about this moment where all these things are becoming, people are aware of this already. People know about this thing. And so it's already shifting from like, we need to bring people's attention to it, to like, we need to figure out the afterlife of these things. I was teaching at Harvard this term, and the Sackler Museum across the street from the architecture school, which has been there 20 years, they've taken the name off of it. It's no longer like the whole building, its character, its nomenclature has now shifted in relationship to precisely this issue. There were, you know what I mean? So like, it's not only about bringing awareness, I think it's like change. Like these, so the notion that this would be a sanctified cultural realm that used to be supported by drug dollars, well, maybe now it's not a sanctified cultural realm. Maybe that was the problem in the first place.
That's an interesting point.
You know, I want to follow up on something that John said, which I mean brings up something I'm trying to kind of understand about your presentation, which by the way is just like really amazing, and I just love this project. You know, it seems like there's different genres of theses, right? And those can sometimes map onto the different kinds of expertise that architects utilize, or the different modes of practice that we see architects engaging in. And so, you know, the first part of your project is really about a kind of demonstration of expertise. Like you're like clearly the expert on this typology, like you thought a lot about how to create them. I mean, your drawings are, you know, in the idiom of the kind of dry AutoCAD, you know, black and white drawing. And so then like to come to this end point, it was so kind of surprising because it is now out of operating in like a totally different mode, which is to say like a kind of disciplinary tongue-in-cheek, you know, sort of speculative proposal. And the other thing that this is, so far as I understand it, is, you know, like the previous couple of presentations had other ways of demonstrating like the text that, you know, that they read for the project. And this to me seems like very much in that line, like this is a kind of your intellectual precedents, like now made sort of spatialized and constructed into this, you know, kind of spatial and visual edifice. And so I think it's so smart, so smart. But I guess to formulate this into a question, like how do you see like the afterlife of this project? I mean, is it about the kind of technical expertise, or is it about the disciplinary proposal that like this part constitutes?
I think the manual is supposed to serve as like a very functional object in the world that can be disseminated, such that like architects are better equipped to understand a world that they don't necessarily have a lot of experience with. There's a lot of definitions, there's a lot of words that I learned in this, and I think that like in the rollout of these facilities, having this kind of cheat sheet will make for better facilities. I think that something that I think this image starts to kind of play with something that's like a little bit different in terms of like, I think what you were maybe loosely addressing with the idea that you would do like a social thesis or something like that, or like it's this way and it's about community and it looks a certain way. And I think I've been really resident towards that divide, because I don't think that just because you create work that has more of a social bent, that it has to follow that normative aesthetic. And in kind of choosing to have like more formal drawings, I wanted to make it almost feel more real and to try and dissolve some of the barriers between the idea that like, if it's a social project, it needs to be done in like cartoon and things like that. I don't know if that makes sense.
I mean, well, what I wondered was why not show like, show something about the experience of being in those spaces. I mean, I feel like your project is it like fits within other kinds of like the gay bathhouse project or like the whorehouse or something. It's like, buildings that have to facilitate activities which are considered to be like on the fringe of acceptability or something. And yet, like the walls have to be in a certain place to facilitate these activities. And yet, you do wonder about, or I wonder about the experience of being there, the experience about, of being there on drugs, and like what would like a kind of very atmospheric drawing look like. And I mean, you could totally choose to include something like that, but you didn't. And so I don't know that it necessarily has to look like a cartoon. I mean, there's a whole like wide variety of choices. And it's interesting that you've kind of chosen this mode.
Yeah.
If I can.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, if I can echo on that comment, I confess I wasn't 100% engaged completely, but I sort of looked through the presentation, and so yeah, to me also that turn towards the end, the exhibition and clipping the elements from the Walgreens, that was kind of surprising. I think, I mean, the topic is very provocative, subject is very provocative. Opioid crisis, obviously pretty serious. Did I sound like Trump now? Anyway, but I think, so it's a provocative topic. So I, again, as a straightforward architect, I would love to see, you went through really quickly those 3 different phases of intervention, and I sit here wondering, how do I evaluate whether that's effective for opioid overdose prevention facility? At a glance, is all of them sort of seems like a pretty conventional layout, and also the first phase of that sort of parasitic circular thing is interesting, but it also kind of seems problematic because it seems very transparent and public, and probably if you're overdosing on opioid, you probably don't want to be treating yourself where it's completely visible from everybody else around. So I think, again, with a limited time, I mean, obviously that your drawings and diagrams are great. So, it's quite quite obvious that you have this capacity of representation. That's, I can't help but ask. So now you communicated your project, each one of them very clearly. So, then I can't help questioning the architecture itself. That I think kind of relates to Elizabeth's comment on experiential aspect of each of these proposals, because I really wonder, sit here wondering whether those are effective as overdose preventions. And I'm really sure that you have capacity to make the architecture more powerful to serve, to assist the overdose prevention. So that's the part that I would love to see personally more development on.
Yeah, Ben and I spoke briefly about that like the project is quantifiably missing perspectives. Like the manual was used to inform the plans and the elevations, but then the perspectives should be performed to like test like the third layer of like the success of the designs. And I think that it would be, performing some like perspectives and kind of walkthroughs of those spaces would definitely better test the success of both the manual and the spatial elements.
Lucy, just one thing. I think you have been talking about usability and visibility. Correct me if I'm wrong. And I think the last product that you have made, for me, it's like an architectural capricious. It's not even a folie because it's not useless. So how could you turn this kind of John Haydock's architecture or some Charles Moore's ideas that you have in here? How could you go back and add that part of usability that maybe is lost in this just temporary exhibition? Could it be changed into, again, a functional, let's say functional in the terms that you have noted at the beginning of your presentation? Could it be changed, or is it not necessary? I mean, it's just another way to keep researching, because for me this thesis is much more than that. It's the beginning of a dissertation. I have to say that. So congrats.
Thank you. Yeah, I think like I thought about I had many conversations with myself about at the beginning, because I knew I did want to use the Sackler Wing as a site, about actually making it into a functioning overdose prevention site. And so it was something that I like definitely grappled with, but it's not great context. You know, like I think it's really interesting context in its relationship to Central Park, and Central Park is a cruising spot, and like the queer roots of like the harm reduction movement. Like a lot of the harm reduction movement was like invented in sex in Central Park, but it's not a good contemporary. I didn't feel it was a good contemporary site for an actual overdose prevention.
Sorry, I'm not saying this project. I'm saying this strategy of building a new element, which is using this kind of small pieces and combine them and find the proper place. It doesn't have to be in here. You know what I mean?
I have a related concern to Javier's, and that is the radical difference between the Walgreens site and sites like the gallery, because they are obviously intended for different things, but inextricably tied to one another. So I do think there's a responsibility, which several of your critics have been raising in the last comments, to try to tie these things together, because they seek to be apart and they cannot be apart anymore. So your thesis attempts to link them in a way that is inextricable. That linking is, I think, still in need of further elaboration.
Okay.
I mean, I'm struck by the first part of the project seems to be in the manual about best practices. So what do we need to do to make these places carefully and thoughtfully? And then the second half seems to be about a kind of like, representational project, the exhibition. They're both great, but they're kind of like different worlds. I don't mean that we can't have good intentions and good outcomes, but they seem to like serve different masters in a way. Like one is about like, best practices. Where does the counter go? How tall does it need to be? And then there's a second part. When you said the pleasure paradox, like, sorry, I got really excited. I thought like, this is going to be fantastic. We're going to deal with this. We're going to deal with some other kind of like non-medical, non-punitive version of these injection centers. So I think that project's really nice. I really want to see the the pleasure principle injection center. Like that's a mind blower. Like that's, I think, the summer project.
Okay, that's really good feedback.
All right, well, I think we're right at 5 o'clock actually. Unless are there any more comments, we can move to kind of a wrap up. I don't think I see any hands in the air or things like that. But thank you, Lucy. It's been an absolute joy working with you on this project and seeing your evolution of ideas. That's been persistent and consistent throughout really the last year, 12 months at least. So I just want to have a couple comments, and then maybe I'll open it up to the critics. I'd love to hear some general observations from the afternoon. Again, this was the first cycle of this version of graduate thesis. And I'd love to hear general observations, what we could improve on, what I could improve on as a coordinator and instructor for this, how the setup is working, et cetera. Yeah, but I just want to say, it's been a real treat working with everybody this last 2 semesters, the faculty and the students. I've been just so proud to be a part of it, you know, and you've really stepped up. And the quality of research from my point of view was really commendable. And I was really, really happy to see the rigor by which all of you approached your work and the effort that you put forward to produce the work that you produced for today. I said this yesterday, and I'll say it again, being able to do this kind of work in this transitional period of having to move online and work remotely, I can't express how proud I am of each of you to deliver the quality of work that you did. And also to thank the faculty for, you know, persevering through this. And, you know, it's been an enjoyable experience for me. And I really enjoyed the conversations today. Thank you so much for all of your thoughtful and provocative feedback. I will end there, and I'd love to hear any summary comments from the critics.
Well, I'll start off. Thanks for the initial invitation. Originally, I was supposed to come down there and be physically present, which was very nice. This pales in comparison, but I'm happy that we could sort of fulfill the cycle. Also, I would second Ben's comments. I think this is like a trying time, and I just mean thesis, much less the COVID stuff. So I think you guys did both really well. Hard to like have an analytical sense of the institution through 4 projects, but I think what struck me this afternoon was the degree of social imagination that was animating the sort of engine of the project. And I think that was all done really well. I think more than the ethos, which I think it's good, but like you don't get credit for being good, was the beginning of moving that ethos into deliverables, for lack of a better term, of moving the idea of a more just society or better representation or new levels of care, that there was some calibration of that into something, a building, a situation, a landscape. That's what excites me most, is like seeing that imagination move into implementation. And in the implementation, we can then have a conversation about whether we think it would or would not do that. So that's what I really appreciated. And I think that's a real strength of what you guys are starting to do, and individually, but also collectively as a school. So I thought that was great, and congratulations.
Yeah, I also just I'm admiring the work a great deal. I got to also see the projects yesterday, so I guess I have a few more sort of maybe data points. What's maybe a little different about the ones that we saw today seems to be maybe like the degree of kind of personal investment that the 4 projects had in the respective interests. I mean, not that the people yesterday weren't committed. It's not that I'm not trying to say that, but this seemed to be like, you know, there seemed to be like a real kind of personal investment in the various topics that people were engaging. And also there was a really interesting, like, I feel like yesterday there was a real emphasis on research, whereas here the research is clearly there, but the emphasis was maybe more so on how that knowledge was then kind of tested and pushed like in the design of the projects. And in some cases that came through more in terms of experiments in representation, and in others you know, the experimentation happened more in the design of the spaces and the in the buildings. But yeah, I think everyone did a really amazing job, and I'm really happy to have been a part of it.
Sorry if I can jump on. It was great to see the 2 days worth of work. It's always interesting to see work from different schools. For the past couple of years, I think I've attended mostly reviews at Cal Poly, which is a polytechnical university. So it's a very different attitude. You know, students for their for their degree project, they start with like zoning and building code research and stuff. So it was refreshing for me. I feel like everybody, just in general, you guys had a really solid research and you know, attempted to sort of contextualize your position in the discourse. That was very refreshing to see. Also, just kind of impressed about the quality of your presentation, the verbal presentation. I think everyone was very sort of organized and eloquent, and you clearly had a position and voice, which is often missing from a lot of the presentation that I attend. You know, maybe because it's California, I hear a lot of, oh, well, I kind of tried to do this, but you know, also wanted to do that. You know, I feel like it was completely different, you know, clear position that you guys taken, and very glad to see that. And congratulations to you guys.
Yeah, congrats to all of you. I have to say that I wish I could have all that amount of research here in my university. We don't have that. Instead of that, we have a lot of development of the drawings and technical stuff. I think if we could mix both things, we would all do a great research. So I think it's a matter of time, when to start one thing and when to stop the other thing. Because as we have seen today, there are some cases where research were too deep, but not too close to the ending result as a technical drawing. So that's just one thing. But apart from that, I have to say that you all made a great effort, even though in these conditions that for all of you and for us have been really strange. Let's say strange or weird or whatever. So congrats for that, and be thankful to all of you.
You know, it's been a pleasure to see the transition of the projects over the course of the semester. And it strikes me that the thesis work typically starts through presenting a narrative in a sequential way through a series of images that, like a lecture, that you're building the case. And then typically at maybe the halfway point or the 2/3 point, the students tend to shift to artifacts and drawings that are going to be hung on a wall. And that shift of scale and the anticipated scale and nature of the presentation inevitably has a major impact on the work. And so I'm kind of wondering how things would be different if we hadn't roughly at midterm moved to remote teaching, which effectively changed the whole end of the semester in really major ways, far more major than, you know, physical models versus not physical models. Really how the work is framed for its interaction with the reviewer, and therefore what do you end up developing in order to make that powerful in a room as opposed to on a screen.
All right. Well, I think, you know, unless there's anything else that anybody wants to say, we can probably wrap it up. You know, again, thanks everybody for your time this afternoon. I had a great time. It was so great to hear all of the feedback and the comments. I've been taking a lot of notes, and I'll be recording, you know, a lot of this in my own journals. So thanks to everybody for being here. And you know, thanks again to the students. It's been a wonderful semester.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. And yeah, I hope I see you all soon.
Yeah.
All right. See everybody.
Now all the students can go drink together.